Hi everyone, this is the first part of my three-part sequence on production and cost. I decided to record these two chapters because the concepts introduced in these chapters are relatively straightforward with a lot of definitions and calculations. This information, however, will be important for us to study how competition, or lack thereof, impacts profits and prices later this semester. Of course, you can always email me or talk to me before or after class if you have any questions on this material. A big simplification that we'll be making in this class is that we only need labor and physical capital to produce any product, whether it be cars, computers, or clothes. In other words, all we need to produce anything that we want is workers and machines. We will denote the quantity of labor using capital L, whereas we will use capital K to denote the quantity of capital. Economists don't use C for capital because we reserve C for household consumption in macroeconomics, which we'll be studying towards the end of the semester. Now, when we study a firm's production and cost, we must distinguish between two time periods. The first time is the short run. I like to think of the short run period as consisting of a day or a week. In this short time period, economists would say that labor is variable while capital is fixed. What we mean by that is that a manager could hire or fire people at will, but could not buy or sell machinery and effectively alter the production line immediately. However, labor and capital are both variable in the long run. What that means is that in 5 to 10 years, a manager can still hire or fire people at will, just like in the short run. However, the manager is now able to buy more machines or sell off some machines depending on whether the company wants to ramp up production or downsize its operations. Parts 1 and 2 of this sequence of videos will study the short-run analysis, whereas Part 3 will focus on the long-run analysis. We use the production function to analyze a firm's ability to use labor and capital to produce its product. It's called the production function because one can write out a mathematical equation to define the relationship between the two inputs, which are labor and capital, and the output, which is the product being produced. Here, I've used an example based on a pizza restaurant to show the relationship between the number of workers, L, the number of pizza ovens, K, and the resulting number of pizzas produced in a day, Q. Note that the number of pizza ovens is constant at 1 because we are assuming that in the short run, the number of pizza ovens that the restaurant owns when it opens in the morning is the same amount that it owns by the time the restaurant closes at night. Therefore, the only way to increase the number of pizzas produced in a day is by hiring more workers. Indeed, notice that an increase in the number of workers is always associated with an increase in total production, or TP. Since we assume that more workers means more pizza, we refer to the increase in production when hiring an extra worker as the worker's marginal product. Notice that the pizza restaurant is unable to produce any pizzas without any workers. In other words, Q equals 0 when L equals 0. The pizza ovens won't make the pizzas themselves. Therefore, we have a dash associated with the value of marginal product when L equals 0, since we can't calculate an increase in production when there are no workers employed. More interestingly, the chart implies that the first worker is able to produce 14 pizzas. Therefore, the marginal product of the first worker is 14 pizzas, since the first worker is able to produce production by 14 pizzas. Notice how the second worker is able to increase production to 35 pizzas. Therefore, the marginal product of the second worker is 35 minus 14, which is equal to 21 pizzas. Thus, we can calculate marginal product as a change in the quantity of output, or pizzas, divided by the change in the quantity of workers. An important trend to point out here is that we assume that marginal product initially increases with each additional worker, but eventually marginal product decreases as the number of workers starts to get large. This is because with a small workforce, workers are able to effectively specialize their job duties. With only one worker, that person has to take the order from customers, make the pizzas, bring the pizzas to the customers, and clean up after the customers have left. However, with two workers, or L equals 2, one worker can work the front of the house and handle the customers, whereas the other worker can focus exclusively on making pizzas, allowing the restaurant to operate more efficiently and more productively. Notice, however, that marginal product eventually decreases with each additional worker. More on that in the next slide. Imagine 8 or 9 workers making pizzas in a cramped kitchen. When the number of workers gets too large like this, they might end up getting in each other's way, or there's probably less for an additional worker to do, so a new hire will provide a smaller benefit to the restaurant, leading to a lower value for marginal product. Economists refer to this phenomenon as the law of diminishing marginal returns. Along with marginal product, the other important production concept is average product, which is simply calculating the total production, Q, divided by the number of workers, L. The initial value for average product is a dash because we cannot calculate average product when there are no workers hired, since any number divided by 0 is undefined. It is important to understand the connection between marginal product and average product. Notice that the average product of an additional worker increases anytime the marginal product of that additional worker is larger than the previous average product. In other words, higher values of marginal product are associated with more productive workers. However, once the law of diminishing marginal return sets in, productivity decreases with additional workers as the new worker's marginal product is less than the previous average product. The phenomenon we discussed in the previous slide is summarized here. Again, when the new marginal product is greater than the previous average product, the new average product increases. However, when the new marginal product is less than the previous average product, the new average product decreases. Graphically, we can see that anytime the marginal product curve is above the average product curve curve is upward sloping. However, whenever the marginal product curve is below the average product curve curve is downward sloping. Therefore, the maximum point of the average product curve is where it intersects the marginal product curve. Before proceeding to part 2 of the 3-part sequence, I encourage you to take some time playing with the Excel spreadsheet I provided on Moodle to make sure that you can calculate the tables covered in this video. Remember, you'll be able to use the Excel spreadsheet on the final exam, so it's in your best interest to make sure that you are comfortable with the calculations introduced in this video. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have.